My name is Rick Rosso. I am the Senior Advisor and Wadhwani Chair here at CSIS running the India program. Great to see everybody on a Friday afternoon when we're all sort of living in a strange limbo and all, but Indian State Energy, there's still an excited group about that, so that's good to see. First and foremost, those of you that have been to CSIS events before know that we start off with our safety announcement. We have no indication that there's any reason to be worried, but just in case something does happen, I am your designated safety officer, so please follow me running and screaming out of the building. We'll all be safe and okay. It's great to have everybody come out today to talk about the launch of the State and Urban Initiative. I took over the India chair here at CSIS 3 years ago, and after 16 years in the private sector working with India, and some of my early work, was focused on that first American event in 1990, which was focused on large power projects. And they ran into payment difficulties, and there I was just out of college from Grand Valley with my Russian degree, going to Tamil Nadu and trying to wrestle with state governments to get these dues cleared up. So that was a real early introduction into center state dynamics and the powers that states actually do have. So a kind of great introduction early in my career, my journey with India, seeing this divide of powers between center and states. And in some instances like electricity, water, sanitation, where states really do kind of drive the agenda. I've always had kind of that fire in my belly to get a platform to do a lot more with states. And so coming into CSIS, it's great to have this kind of platform. So we kicked off some of our work with states about a year ago. We have a weekly update that covers key regulatory and legal developments at the state level. We pulled together a meeting we call the India States Engagement Forum, where we bring together a lot of the U.S. organizations that engage Indian states to talk about, who's been to India, did you go to a state, did you see a chief minister, are you going to host one? So really trying to share a little bit more for the first time in terms of how the United States is engaging states as a whole. And then just about a year ago, to get this phone call from the Department of State saying that they were thinking about doing a bit of work directly with states as well on energy. And I'll save that conversation for the two people from State Department that are here with me. But this is a really kind of, for us, it's a terrific way to channel, some of these early learnings we have, as well as my experience with states, into something that is clearly so important, so critical, and there's a lot of great work to be done. So taking this platform we've created and starting to use it to try to channel U.S. engagement with states on energy, is very exciting for me, and it's great to have such a terrific partner as well, Sarah Ladislaw, who runs the energy program here at CSIS, to have Sarah, as really kind of one of the country's top energy experts to be able to lean on, leverage, and kind of use her expertise for a program like this. So let me first start off by introducing then, just to my left, Nisha Biswal. Nisha, as you all know, is the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia at the State Department. Previously, she's held that role for about 3 years now. Previously was the Assistant Administrator for Asia at USAID, spent a number of years on the Hill, House Appropriations and Foreign Affairs. And then to her left, Amos Hochstein, who is with State Department as well, Special Envoy and the Coordinator for International Energy Affairs at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the Department of State. He's also a seasoned Hill veteran, having previously served as Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and worked with both Senator Dodd and Senator Warner's office. So let me first hand it off to Nisha, please.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's interesting because you have brought together kind of a parallel in private sector or at CSIS and at the State Department of the India expertise and the energy expertise, and that's really what we've done also at the State Department is bring together the India expertise and the energy expertise to look at what the opportunities are. And the reason I think in many ways this came into being is in our engagements across India, we were increasingly finding that while there was just tremendous opportunity and demand in India, that there was not necessarily an agile way of accessing those opportunities and that demand. Because, there's not one India, there are many Indias. And conversely, in the United States, as we think about where the expertise is, where there is the policy and the regulatory knowledge that would be useful for India, that there's not one United States, that there's such a diversity of experience, of models, of opportunity, and how do you make that more agile? When I was in Chicago and met with the mayor's office there to talk about what Chicago is doing and how that is relevant to India. And they talked about how they're kind of creating a sustainable Chicago initiative that's really looking at smart infrastructure and how that might be relevant in many ways of the experience of India. When I went to Silicon Valley and they talked about and Los Angeles, and they talked about the regulatory environment that has allowed California's real, flourishing of clean technology and what that could do in terms of serve as an opportunity and a model for India. And how do you create those kinds of connections? And how do you create a more agile interface that allows a relationship that is increasingly moving beyond G to G, increasingly moving beyond, Washington to New Delhi. I like to say that the U.S. India relationship is moving from being global to increasingly also being local. And that's where we need to work on the interface. That's where we need to work on how do we help support those connections, those local connections, the state and urban connections. Because they say that the vast majority of the infrastructure of the India of 2030 is yet to be built. And that includes in it the energy infrastructure. And we know that India is going to have an all of the above requirement in terms of how it meets its energy needs. But we also know that India is going to have some of the largest opportunities in terms of clean energy. And how do we help navigate that space for what the United States offers? And so as we were struggling with all of that, Amos and I started talking about this and started saying, well, how do we help create that kind of an interface? And in many ways, I think that's where that creative brainstorming that allowed all of this to come together and say, well, we should help create the interface if it doesn't already exist. And that's why I think it's such a great opportunity today to be able to launch it. And maybe I'll let Amos talk about the more specifics, because this is really something that his bureau has spent a lot of time and energy and expertise and resources in pulling together.
Okay, please, Amos.
Well, thanks, Rick. Thanks, Sarah. First of all, I have to say thank you. Before we talk about the initiative itself, I have for many years wanted to be on the same panel, on the same stage with Nisha. So, we're both going to be leaving soon, but we started our careers on the Foreign Affairs Committee, working together on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and our paths took we went on different paths for 20 years or so, and then came back to working together at the State Department. And so therefore, I'm just excited to do this. My first government trip to India was in the 90s with Nisha, right, meeting with Prime Minister Vajpayee.
So it's kind of coming full circle.
So we're coming full circle to beginning to end. So again, thank you, CSIS. That I know wasn't your intention, but to give you my final request at the State Department. But let me take up where Nisha left off. The baseline, before we get to India specifically, no matter if you are a developing or a developed country, and no matter what stage of development you're in inside that spectrum, without affordable and reliable sources of energy, you cannot grow. You reach a limit in your ability to grow. You can't create small businesses. You can't make your economy more efficient in general. That's true in a developing country. It's true in the United States. We are still striving throughout our economy. If you look at what businesses try to do, it's reduce energy costs, create better efficiencies throughout the system in order to that's what can bring back manufacturing, that's what can bring back jobs, is that difference that energy makes. And at the other end of the spectrum, if you don't have the basic knowledge that I know that I will have an interconnection to the energy grid or to an energy connection of some kind, I'm not going to build a business, whether it's small or large. And therefore, I think that is what Prime Minister Modi identified when he became Prime Minister and announced energy as one of the key components of what he wanted to achieve in his first term in office, of two things. One is increasing renewable energy integration, and announcing the 175 gigawatts of renewable energy, of wind and solar in India. And the second, the connecting more people to solve the access concern, where people, literally hundreds of millions of people, 300 million people or so, do not have access to the grid, to energy infrastructure. And that's where we started working together, the United States and India, from the first meeting that Prime Minister Modi had with President Obama, through Secretary Kerry's meetings with his counterparts, of talking about how can we work together on addressing some of these issues. And the issues are plentiful. There are a lot of things that have to go right in order to be able to solve those problems. Setting goals is extremely important because it sets the tone of where the country is going. But beyond setting the goals and the tone, there has to be the follow-through on the private sector being able to come in and doing that work. And what does that mean? You can't simply say, I'm going to have 175 gigawatts of renewable energy if you can't solve some of the fundamental problems that are leading to why it's not happening. So there are certain low-hanging fruit that will get done automatically. And then you have the next layer, which is government, central government regulation that will encourage additional, the next level of fruit on that tree to be able to fall. But then you get to a limit. Why aren't banks in India and outside of India participating in the finance of those projects? It's not because they don't think the opportunity is there. On the contrary, India is probably the best place in the world to think about investment in renewable or any other new technology in energy, because you have so many people off the grid and so much requirement for investment. But the regulatory environment and the reality of all the finance issues has to be resolved for the private sector to come in and make that investment. Now, if you think of India as where Nisha discussed the future, if you just want to keep pace with the status quo of energy interconnection and access, taking into account growth of population, over the next 30 years or so, you're going to need $1 trillion of investment just to keep pace. But that's not what we want. What we all want is not to keep pace with the current status quo. We want to be able to see far more integration and interconnection and access into the energy system in order for the country to continue to produce the numbers of jobs that are necessary for the young generation coming into the economy. And so for that, you need even more investment than just $1 trillion that's going to be required over the next few decades. So I think that's where we looked at the government to government at the federal level, at the central level. And we have the Department of Energy of the United States has a number of programs. OPIC has a number of programs. AID has a number of programs. We then created a task force that we co-chair between the two countries on energy finance, on looking at new instruments of finance for renewable energy that have worked around the world that could work for India. We've done that in the private sector to private sector as well as government to government. But you reach a certain limit, because just like the United States, where the regulatory authorities of the central government, the federal government from Washington, are rather limited in the energy sector. At the end of the day, the states in the United States have all the power. They will decide the future of their own states. And that is why we have such a myriad of progress in the US from state to state. Some have progressed far better than others. Some have done far better than others. Some have attracted far more investment than other states. Same is true in India. If you look at where the ability to really make that change, in addition to what the central government is doing, it's going to be in the states. And that's where I want to borrow from what Nisha was, this is the conversation that Nisha and I were having, is how do you get there? In other words, we already have programs like MIT and Georgetown that are doing work with Bihar and Maharashtra states, where looking at energy infrastructure technology and innovation and software that can be used in those states in order to advance. Or looking at financial institutions in the United States that have worked on green bonds before, or have worked at other financial infrastructures that can be borrowed from the experience in the United States at the state and local level, and could be used in India as well in the state and local level. What do you do with the disconnected from the grid in the urban areas, as well as the more isolated villages that are not connected to the grid other? Those are going to need different kinds of solutions. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution in any of these. So we started having this conversation of how do we encourage that kind of conversation. And I think that's where we're grateful to be able to partner with CSIS to create a platform for where our local governments can work through, our universities across the country can work through, our entrepreneurs can work through, and have this platform that will connect the states that want to have this experience with the already the existing experience here. And one of the things we've talked with our friends in India has been, this is not about learn from what we've done, we know how to do this. On the contrary, we've made so many mistakes in the United States. We have messed this thing up in every way possible. So what we're suggesting is don't mess up where we did.
Right.
If you're going to mess up, mess up, exactly. If you're going to mess it up your own way.
The freedom of end of term to say these things.
Yes. I feel very free these days. People say, oh, you know, it's on the record. I said, I don't care. But it's a real, we've come to, we still have mistake models and we have success models. And we have remarkable things happen. Energy is one of the places that has advanced in leaps and bounds. I mean, we have not seen incremental change in energy. We have seen transformational change in energy over the last 5-7 years. And the United States today is the energy superpower of the world. And that's not because we drill for more oil or for more gas. It's because across the spectrum of energy, whether it's oil or gas or solar or wind or efficiency or finance, we're in the lead. And that's what I think there's such a natural interconnection and cooperation for the United States and India, specifically at the subnational level, that could be fruitful. We already have winners and losers in the United States, and we have winners and losers already in the energy space in India as well. Mm-hmm. Some states are advancing far more than the others. But you don't want that gap to be too wide. We have to figure out a way that through this platform, through what CSIS is going to do as a convening platform, to be able to match up the states that need it and want it with the entities in the United States. That I think the learning can be, once we do that, the learning is going to start switching from one directional to two directional. In other words, there are things that can be done in India that will then be imported back into the United States because they were done more efficiently there. So that's why we're here today. That's why we're so excited to launch this. And so grateful to CSIS for both launching this event here today, but more importantly, for the work that you're going to do over the next year as developing this initiative forward and implementing it. Thank you.
See, it excites me so much, I just want to run out and start working on it rather than talking about it with you all. Better vision than I can share. Sarah, you know, the brains behind the operation here at CSIS and Energy, great to have you.
She's the brains behind the operation everywhere, not just in CSIS.
Well, listen, I just want to, echo a lot of things that have already been said. I like the parallelism on the stage, right, which is one of the best things that we can do here at CSIS is when two programs come together to match our expertise. And Rick and I, one of the things I really like is, Rick has early and often identified the strategic opportunities that come with state and local initiatives. And I couldn't say that to be more true for anything than the energy sector, right? I mean, energy is such a strategic element in global conversations, as everybody knows. And what we don't often realize is we often think about energy as being powerful because of what it does at a national level. But really, the place that we've seen the most change, and Amos is exactly right, it has been a revolution, nothing short of a revolution over the last several years. If I took you back 10 years and asked you to look at the energy sector as it is today, you probably wouldn't anticipate all of the changes that have not only happened, but the ones that are about to happen. And so we had Fatih Birol here this morning, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, had a really great conversation about the important role that India will play in the future of global energy dynamics, not just because of the energy demand that is coming from a country of its size and anticipated growth, but as Amos quite rightly said, we always have to remind ourselves, we think about these kinds of interactions as trying to help shape the initiatives in India regarding energy, but what we realize in our experience with China over the last decade has shown us this once again, that countries where energy is developing and creating new access and new opportunities are precisely the kind of opportunities that shape the energy environment going forward. I mean, look at all of the things that a country like China has achieved over the last decade that have in turn shaped our energy future going forward. we expect nothing less of the energy future for India, and that's why it is such a huge strategic imperative for not only the United States, but countries around the world to be involved in that. I wrote a piece several months ago because as we were starting to research for this initiative, and I was sort of thinking about other sort of global energy trends, looking at all of the activity that is coming towards India from international engagement, right? I mean, it's nothing less than mind-blowing, the amount of international engagement, both from the public and private sector. And I think what we've got to realize is that coordinating those kinds of initiatives so that we get the most bang for our buck, and not sort of always having them be competing initiatives, but certainly enabling them to sort of catalyze other opportunities, is really, really important because as you see, especially at a time of huge energy transformation, symbolic successes, right, where countries or states or local communities crack the code on something. Think about how many energy conversations you've been involved in where you pull out a particular state or a particular city or a particular experience as an example of what is possible, and it validates that theory. And I think a huge amount of that is going to take place in India, and I think it's really important for there to be a platform to be able to have people have greater awareness of those opportunities. And so what I think about this initiative, I think it's a huge opportunity for us to be able to coordinate, but then also to be able to localize, right? And all energy really is local. A lot of authority, both on social license and on investment and on regulation, happen at the local level. Can't think of a better opportunity to have this initiative get kicked off at this particular point in time to really show that state and local opportunities and connections between the United States and India are really where the vast majority of opportunity lies, at least in my opinion.
Well, and we've seen something that from the central level that the government has acted on. People talk about, how much is Modi reformed, how much deep reform. But if you look at the things that have transpired so far, I mean, one of the first dramatic reforms that they did was absolutely liberalizing the coal sector. Before it was very difficult for private companies to become merchant coal operators. That got liberalized. Licensing for oil and gas companies completely changed. Not a lot of attention to that yet because, global investment in oil and gas exploration and development isn't quite as high. Liberalizing pricing for oil and gas as well, that's taken place. Then the program to bail out the state electricity utilities, the UDE bailout program. 17 states have signed on, and there are hard parameters that states are supposed to adopt as part of this. There's also a project to try to get every single village in India electrified by next year, which by all rights, is absolutely on track. And then to try to look at actually electrifying every single home a few years later. I mean, these are massive goals and targets that Center is announcing. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, it's up to states to figure out the ways to try to meet these objectives if they agree with them. So it's a huge screen that we have to work with. But as we've uncovered already, and we had a private session among some of the groups we know that already have state engagement programs just before this. There are so many organizations across the United States, foundations, universities, research laboratories, companies that have programs, and sometimes you just got to shed a bit of light on them. Some of these are enormously successful, but done in kind of a pilot phase and getting those a little bit more widely known. So I think there's great opportunity that we've uncovered just in the first few weeks of moving on this. So we're going to open it up to questions in a second, but I thought I'd provoke our two featured speakers just beforehand with a couple of questions. Amos, you talked about U.S. states as having differences, India as well, but are there other countries that we've actually had this kind of subnational outreach in this kind of a targeted way, or is India really a test project for the world?
We've had a number of subnational programs in general. We have not had one that's like this. This is really a first where we're doing a subnational to subnational, specifically looking at energy with an entity like CSIS as a convener. We've done a number of things where it's the federal level in one country and the subnational in the other. And variations of it. And in China we did something somewhat similar, but not exactly. So this really is, I think, a first of its kind in what we're doing with India. And partly it's because of the unique similarity in the regulatory system of the differences between what the center does and what the states and local do. So it is a little bit different than what we've ever done before.
Yeah. Nisha, getting a program like this in the last year of the administration, you've seen transitions many times in the past. When you think about programs, and especially like all the great things that we built over the years with India, how much of that tends to be hardwired from one administration to the next, not even irrespective of whether it's a change in political party or whatever. I mean, we know this one might be a little bit different, but probably all of them at this point look like they're going to be a little bit different. How much of the engagement do you think is hardwired? How much of that is pull from India? So even if our leadership is thinking a little bit differently, they'll try to pull us back in a similar direction. How much do you think that we have in place right now, the different dialogues, initiatives like this, would remain in place, and how much of that is kind of up for grabs and reassessment?
I mean, look, every successive administration is going to add to and create some areas of focus, some areas of additionality. But the U.S.-India relationship is so broad and so complex and spans so many different dimensions. To pull back from that is not in anyone's interest. It's not in the U.S. interest and not in the Indians' interest. I think the next administration firmly grasps that and wants to actually build on and add their own areas of focus. But I don't necessarily think that that means that they're going to move away from things that have been built up and put in place, because these are things that are essentially responding to a demand that's already out there, a demand that we see both in India, where they're looking for additional ways to engage and to attract and to partner with the United States, but also a demand that we've seen in the United States. As you know, I think I've gone to 9 or 10 different metropolises in the United States, big urban areas like Chicago, like Los Angeles. I was just in Houston. And the desire in these cities to find new areas of opportunity to partner with India is huge. And each brings its own major kind of economic portfolio that they want to engage with, whether it's in the energy sector, whether it's in the healthcare sector, or in you know, other areas that they want to provide that kind of connectivity, of partnering opportunity. But the demand is also huge in the U.S. private sector, where increasingly when I talk to you know, major companies, India is right there at the very top when they look at emerging markets that they're focused on. And it wasn't there 3 or 4 years ago. 3 or 4 years ago, there was much more pessimism or skepticism about you know, doing business in India. And
That's
I
right
know
around when you took over the role at State.
yeah.
Everything just starts blooming all of a sudden.
Sure, you can put that out there as my. No, but the bottom line is that this is an initiative that's really reflecting on the demand that's out there, and how do we help meet that demand. So even if we didn't create it, it would have become put together by some other entity. I mean, I think you guys had actually gone down that path yourselves anyways, of starting to look at India in the kind of disaggregate. You know, how do you take this massive a monstrosity of complexity and start to distill it and disaggregate it into areas of opportunity, and how do you understand it? Because India is just so massive. And so complex in so many different ways and so many layers, that this kind of an initiative, I think, would have created itself even if we hadn't put our heads together and say, hey, we really need to do this.
Yeah, great. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything. Otherwise, we'll open it up to the floor out here.
No, I was just, you know, I do think there's an inevitability in energy markets, right, and connections at the local level and in this transition. I do think you're right. I think it makes sense. But, you know, just to be mildly political, it's a great time for institutions to recognize that being outside your capital is a pretty important thing. It's not just a political reality here in the United States. It's literally everywhere. And so to connect these really important strategic issues that also have commercial resonance outside state capital, country capitals, into sort of local communities, I think is really a very, something you guys created with foresight. Yes, we would be doing it, but I think that to put that kind of connection on a higher strategic plane is a really important thing, and something I hope we're going to do a lot more of.
Yeah.
But Rick, if I may add, just because I think that I may be somewhat less optimistic than you were about some of the inevitability of success of Uday and of the electrification of villages and small cities and towns and houses. I think part of the reason that we need this initiative is because I'm not sure, I think the policies are all right from the center, and the drive is right. But in the field, it's not a monolithic. There are some that are actually in areas where they are working on the electrification, but in others, it's stalled. Not all states have joined Uday, and not all states that have joined Uday are ultimately going to remain in Uday because they're right now not doing the kinds of things that will not take these utilities back into debt. So if the utilities end up in a cycle of coming out of debt and back and don't do any of the reform that is necessary to keep out of debt, of what got them into debt in the first place, we're going to be back to square one. So there are key factors here that have to change, and one of them is the utilities and the reform in tariffs. And how do you and some of these, by the way, are very painful. These are hard political issues that people who are running for re-election in this country or in India don't have a long history of taking decisions. They're going to say, I'm going to do this even though it's going to hurt me in the next election. That's not an India problem or a US problem. That's a global democracy problem. So that's where we have to come up with saying, okay, the center is doing these kind of incentives. What do we need to do in the convening of this, of getting, okay, here are some ideas, Mr. Chief Minister or utility regulator. Here's a problem that we had. Remember, California went bankrupt, and the utilities were in a disastrous shape just a few years ago, not that long ago. And we had a regulator in California that actually turned things around. And it wasn't easy. It was really hard. But if you look at where they are today, it's an entirely different place where they're actually growing and seeing more investment, and the energy picture looks bright again. But that wasn't the case just a few years ago. That's an example where the federal government had nothing to do with it. And that's the same example that we're going to have to work on here. So I think I'm a little less optimistic, but I think it's also the reason why I think this is necessary.
Well, you know, and I have eyes wide open on this. You know, remembering 2002, 2003, when the last BJP government put forward the Advanced Power Reform Development Program, the Amendments to the Electricity Act, you saw a number of states. You know, those that have been up to my office a few floors up, one wall is decorated with a chart of Indian state elections going back to 1968. And you can see the hard breaks for states that tried deep electricity reforms. Congress used to be a player in the state of Orissa, and they tried it in the 90s and haven't been seen since. Naidu tried it in Andhra Pradesh. Jayalalitha tried it in 2001 in Tamil Nadu and lost all of her seats in Parliament in 2004. So I've seen, you know, there is a hard, bright line, and that's why, you know, having great groups that have come around the table, you know, like MIT and some of the fantastic work that they're doing, it's going to be about innovation too. That's right. You know, they've got to find a way to cut losses, to hit price points that are political bright lines, and you know, I try to keep that in mind. I do, you know, that there are political bright lines on these issues. I saw we got microphones coming around. Ray Vickery up in the front, my original India guru from back in my beginnings. If you could tell us your name, your organization, and please try to keep it to a brief question. Although Ray, you've got the prerogative on giving a statement if you want.
I don't have to be brief. I'm Ray Vickery from Albright Stonebridge. I want to follow up on Rick's question, and I very much appreciate, Nisha, what you're saying about a lot of it being hardwired and so forth. But it is perfectly apparent that with the new administration, the emphasis on renewables is not going to be as great. Oil, gas, coal are going to come up. The concern about climate change and the need to respond to that is going to go down. Nevertheless, we are faced with the opportunity as well as the problem of how public policy is accommodated to this new world. And what would be your recommendations as taking as givens that there's going to be this emphasis on oil, gas, coal, less on renewables, less on climate change? What would be responsible ways in which to go forward on energy as we enter this new environment?
Ray, I'm going to be counterculture for Washington right now, and the sense of in the renewable energy space, the gloom and doom that everybody's decided what's going to happen. I think very little is going to happen that will change. And the reality is that the government's ability to change the trajectory of where world energy is going has become more and more limited. Coal in the United States is not coming back, and I don't care which politician says that it is, because there's not a single act that a member of the U.S. government can do to bring coal back and make it cost-effective and efficient. It's just not the case anymore. So when we had oil at 100, everybody says we needed 200 in order to get renewables to be viable for investment. And when we had it at $100 a barrel, we average about in the 40-something billion dollars a year of investment in the United States in renewable energy. When we went, therefore, to $60 a barrel average the next year and a half, we went to $58 billion of investment in renewable energy, meaning the Tom Friedman article in the New York Times a few years ago of bring on $200 oil was no longer relevant. The same is the case today. The reason that we are seeing the decline in coal in the United States is not because of regulation. It's because for the same reason we don't use VCRs anymore. A new technology came along, meaning we have enormous amounts of gas that will last over a 100-year supply of natural gas at very cheap prices. And as long as price of natural gas in the U.S. is below $3, coal is not really coming back as a relevant option for power plants. Not because government told them so, but because the business argument. I will say the same thing in India. Will coal continue to be a major part of India's energy picture? For sure. That was true when Obama was president, and that is going to be true when Donald Trump is president. But it wasn't President Obama who declared 175 gigawatts of renewable energy as the goal for India. It was Prime Minister Modi, not because of what the US government thought about energy, but because of what the Indian government thought about energy. And I don't see that changing, because there too, you have 300 million people, Ray, as you know better than me, that are not connected to power. And if you want to grow the economy, as we discussed before, you're going to have different solutions. And I think renewable energy is going to grow. I think it's going to grow worldwide, and I think it's going to grow in India as well. Now, the last piece I would say on this is that it's not only about climate change, which is, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of governments, amorphous. It's very difficult, it's intangible. But what's not amorphous or intangible is air quality. And when Beijing has to shut down the entire city and send everybody on vacation for 10 days because they have a bunch of world leaders coming and they want a blue sky, that's not something in the future. That countries around the world can look at the window and say, if I do a lot more coal in the middle of my big cities, that's my future. That's a window into not the distant future, but the near future. India already today is suffering from air quality issues, and the government is aware of it. And that's why I think that they are moving on coal, because of jobs and legacy and all the other issues and the politics of it, and I understand that, and because they want to have some immediate solutions that are cheap, but at the same time moving on renewable energy. I don't know a lot of countries that have a minister whose portfolio is coal and renewable energy, as Piyush Goyal has in India. Well, no, because we have a separate minister for oil and gas in India. Here we do everything. We have all in one. That's I understand. But having coal and renewable in one ministry and oil and gas in another is a unique, approach. But I actually think it matches what I just said. You have the reality of what is today, which is the coal, and Coal India, and growing that and making it more efficient and using the cheap nature of the fuel, while also having the same minister that's looking after coal trying to promote renewable energy investment as much as possible. So I think despite all of what we're hearing in the news and the politics, I think this trajectory is not something that's going to be stopped.
And I'm just going to add one point to what Amos said, because I agree with everything he said. And the one thing I would add to that is you also have a supply and demand issue in terms of the technology that American companies have and that India wants creates its own opportunity here. And so this is really not so much about, is the United States no longer going to back clean energy? It's about, our American companies and our state and federal, authorities that are looking to promote American companies going to tap into the opportunities that exist in India for this, for helping the Indians meet their demand. And at the same time create, economic benefits for the United States. And that's in everyone's interest. So I don't see how we're going to walk away from that.
Varghese, I hope you got the VCR line too. That better be in, yeah.
So my name is Varghese George. I write for the Indian newspaper, The Hindu. So the VCR question actually. The thing is, so when the technology advances, many of these power purchase agreements that have been signed in India, I'm sure sooner or later they're coming up, they will come up, and the price of those per unit of power is going to be a controversy sooner than later. And the thing is, when technology advances and it gets cheaper, those agreements which have been signed 10 years earlier would actually look a huge scandal 5 years down the line. So is there a regulatory or a technological answer which would deal with this disparity or the coming down of prices because of the advancement in technology?
Look, you're right. In other words, as technology advances, you sign contracts, and part of the nature of the business is that you sign long-term contracts. And that's not only an India problem, that's true here. You make bets, and you can only do it based on the technology that's available to you today. And you're right, from a public, those who would want to exploit or to create a scandal would say, why did you sign the contract 10 years ago? Look what we have now. Which, of course, 10 years ago, there was no way of knowing it. I'll give you an example far away from India. Two countries built LNG facilities, Poland and Lithuania. One signed a gas supply deal at the beginning of the process in order to help them finance it. And everybody said they were brilliant for doing it because it allowed them to finance it. Except they did it when oil prices were at $100. By the time they finished the LNG terminal, oil prices were at $45. And it looked like they overpaid by a factor of 100%. While the other country did not do that, they simply bought the gas later. But it could have been the opposite. So you're trying to catch a dropping knife here of deciding when in the cycle of technology do you make the investment. Now, I think what's happening in India when you have power purchase agreements, one of the things that we're working on with the central government, and I think we'll start working on with the states, is having some uniformity. Because one of the barriers to investment in India has been, for renewable energy, has been the cost of negotiating repeated power purchase agreements that cost quite a bit of money to do, and they're all different. And they take 30 months, 35 months to negotiate when they should be taking 10 months, 6 months to negotiate. So as you get to that, and the government now is working on that, as you get to that uniformity in a power purchase agreement across the states, and more states decide, let's do this the same. So if I get Azure Power or anybody else to negotiate a PPA with one state, and then we can use exactly similar document in another state, it saves time and money, but it also will answer your question, which means you'll have less of the ability of losing out to new technologies compared to other states because you have more uniformity there. You're going to have some loss when new technologies come, but I think that's going to be minimized as we have more sophisticated and uniform PPAs across the country.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that, where I think this work to try to get the electricity grids at the state level functioning more efficiently and solvent, to me too, that it becomes less of an issue about small price differences, because small price differences might mean you're dispatched a lot less, and that's part of the reason you've seen contract disputes arise so far right now on high cost electricity in India. The projects aren't being dispatched because they're the most expensive, even if it means not technically honoring provisions in the contract. So if we can play some kind of small role in helping this work to get the grids functioning better, more financially viable, then they'll have a little bit more money too, and it'll be less of a cost pressure, and I think that you'll see projects that may be a little bit more expensive, whether it's legacy or new, will have an easier time having their contracts honored. Yeah, let's go all the way in the back there. You guys are okay for?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Sundar. I'm a second-year graduate student at Georgetown, Democracy and Governance program. And I'm glad you brought the point up about it not being, I mean, fixing regulatory tariffs and issues of that sort will not be an easy challenge or easy task for any political actor. The thing is, and especially I want to take your perspective on this, is politics in the US, for the most part of it, is very much different than that in India. If one case example being Tamil Nadu, which is so addicted and consumed by populism that the electors get punished for not being more populist. Both the parties who alternate back and forth, they do come out with a lot of clientelistic measures, but the one with the most lucrative ones wins. The other one gets a disastrous effect. I was wondering if there was any experience in the United States as far as dealing with that is concerned. How would you incentivize these leaders to think about fixing their regulations?
So are you asking today or 2 weeks ago?
I don't know. You could pick your time period. Thank you.
I think populism is everywhere in the world, and I find that the more local you go, the more populism is localized and an issue. In other words, and as you get down to the more local, meaning prices of commodities, the local services that municipalities do that the central government doesn't really have control over, that's what elections are about. And that's true in India, and I actually think there's more similarity. If you don't look at our national elections in the United States, but go to city council races, look at advisory council races, mayor races, you'll find a lot more of what you're talking about, what you see in India happening at that local level of who is in charge, what my opponent is saying about zoning. I will build parks for everybody. I will, reduce the costs for your water bills, for your electricity bills. I will fight the utilities. Those kind of things. So I think populism is part of democracy, and I think the incentive is the more you create that uniformity, the more you provide the long-term approach, the long-term contracts, the ability to see the benefits of those kinds of rational policies that translate into jobs. As we talked about before, I think both Nisha and I talked about the future, where the growth in India and the requirement to create jobs. If we can rationalize the energy sector and create this boom in energy, the infrastructure that is going to be required is going to create enormous amount of jobs in new sectors. Just to do that. It may not all be long-lasting jobs. It may not be 100-year jobs. But these will be a number of years of the building of the infrastructure and then of the maintaining and managing the infrastructure. So I think as local leaders are able to say, yes, this may hurt, this may be a little bit difficult at the short term, at the short end, the front end, but it will create those jobs and people can start seeing the evidence of the efficiency. If they don't have to use generators anymore, if you have fewer blackouts and brownouts, then I think you can start selling the positives, and that could help in getting public and popular support for it.
Well, I think it's also fundamentally about communication. It's easy to break down into, sound bites, kind of what you're against, but explaining what you're for and why is a little bit more complicated and more nuanced, and I think we have to become a little bit more agile at how do we communicate these policies, how do we explain them, and how do we help build kind of grassroots support, rather than kind of assuming that people won't understand and therefore better not to talk about it. Then you're seeding the ground for how that policy is being talked about. So I think that's on all of us across every spectrum to learn how to talk about these complicated issues in more digestible ways and to build that understanding.
Can I? Oddly enough, we have a project on populism and its effect on climate and energy policy, and it's not a week old. But interestingly, there's a lot of things about today's energy sector that are inherently populistic, right? The prosumer movement, distributed energy generation, ride sharing, whole bunches of things that decentralize the energy system, even though they don't get to scalable long-term solutions and have all kinds of sort of conflicts with centralized electric power sector issues or transportation planning at a state and urban level, they do enable increments of change to happen. And there's a huge amount of that happening, and it's informing people's opinions about their relationship with energy. It's something we're investigating over a decade-long time frame, because changing people's relationships and concepts of energy is like the holy grail of energy policy, right? I mean, if we thought that we could have consumers understand where energy comes from and how it relates to them and their pocketbooks in a more sophisticated way, I can't tell you how many places I've been where that becomes the answer to the questions we all have. Well, it's actually happening. And so that education process and how people regard energy in their lives and those decisions and how it enables them is something that over the long term I think is actually going to change those conversations. It's not a panacea, right? But I do think it's something that is important to watch and may change some of the dynamics in places like that.
And if you really want to be scared, my back of the envelope is you take the challenges on energy in India, multiply by about 10, and you have the challenges in water, and multiply by 50, and you have sanitation. So there are greater challenges ahead, which have roughly the same dynamics, but the pressure points are even harder. But hopefully we'll get some momentum on this one and see if we can translate that to other arenas. Sasha, yeah, I think you.
Well, thanks very much. I'm Sasha Rezer-Kozitsky from Eurasia Group. Rick, a very simple question. You've talked a lot today about U.S. organizations and institutions you want to have participating in this project, but I was wondering if you could speak to the Indian institutions and organizations you at least hope to have participate. I know this is still early days.
Yeah, well, I mean, first and foremost is going to be state governments, the central government, the ministries, the power trading corporations, the private entities, you know, like CESC in Calcutta, which has been taking over some of the private grids. There's great research partnerships already. For instance, you know, the Tata Center in MIT works with IIT Bombay. So we're finding Indian universities as well are doing good work on this. A number of think tanks. You know, I think you looked at Prayas in Pune is doing fantastic work, and we've been reaching out to them already. CEW, Terry. So between, you know, there's a number of prominent think tanks, great companies that are doing terrific work, universities, but center and state governments is going to be, you know, a real primary target. So that's kind of a broad sweep, but certainly making sure those organizations, they know the ground realities. And frankly, like some of the good work that we may do from this is going to be not engaging, you know, with state governments or central government, but you know, maybe there's American universities or an incubator or an accelerator that's helping, you know, companies that are working in this space, looking for low-cost solutions that have absolute application in India, and to find partner institutions, companies, you know, entrepreneurs. So there's going to be a broad range, but you know, that's kind of the general characters that we've been looking at already. Yeah, the back there. Coming to you next.
I can stand up. Thanks for asking. I'm Jordan Sellers with FJS Helter Skelter Politics and Social Science. My question is, can you talk about some of the competitive nature that's going on here in the United States and what we could do to kind of compare and contrast globally and even into like what they can learn from what's going on politically wrong here in the States and like why maybe countries like India shouldn't follow the US's approach to confusion and political things that prevent any type of, I guess, politically correctness in terms of maintaining some type of positive status quo for the country. So what can you learn from the mistakes here in the United States that particularly India should not follow?
This one's a little bit off topic. Do we want to pass on this one? I don't know if this is the group that convened for this question in particular. I'll leave it to you if somebody wants to grab it.
Just India's got a very, very rich, robust, very dynamic political scene, both at the national, at the state, and at the local level. And I think that they are governed by their own dynamics, not so much by following either our successes or our missteps.
I would only say the mistakes that we sometimes make in this country is that we mix our ideology with what's happening on the ground. And that's from both perspectives. There's no zero-sum game when it comes to energy. In most places that I go, I ask, what is the leading state in the US for renewable energy? And the answers that I always get is based on ideology. Meaning people say to me, Washington State, Oregon, Vermont, Maine. They basically think of the blue and red map and they start telling me the blue states are good on renewable energy. Texas is one of the top states in the country in renewable energy and is the leading in wind. and the city, the area in Texas that is the leader is Houston. So that's usually the last city on everybody's expectation. So if we could just separate out what's actually happening, or in the southern Georgia will announce now the completion of 200 megawatts of solar in what is the reddest county, one of the reddest counties in the country. So that points both to the mistake of mixing ideology with what is the business and the future of renewable energy, but it's also the idea that this is why we think it's such a good model for India, by looking at what the states are and the local are actually doing in the US, not what people in Washington are talking about.
We got one up in the front here. Time for one or two more, depending on how quick. So again, name, organization, and a quick question.
Hi, my name is Lori Aniti. I work for the Energy Information Administration of DOE, and we have a group that puts out international energy statistics. And what I'm working on right now is we've been trying to focus more on our international energy outlook. And last year we put together a group that went to China and tried to get a lot of statistics that you normally can't get for energy. And we wanted to try to expand that this year to more, a few more countries. And India was one of the ones we were looking at. So one, I'm wondering, how we can be involved in any way, and maybe find out, one, for our modeling purposes, how to get better statistics and information about what might be the future policies, and how possible it's going to be that they're going to be implemented, and also, what better statistics we could put out.
Yeah, well, we'd love to partner with you on that. We're going to be convening a lot of sessions, some private, some public, among players that are pretty active in this space. So let's make sure we exchange cards and information,
Okay.
and we'll clue you in on the work going forward. But it sounds like what you're working on is a good fit for some things that we have in mind.
Okay, great.
We have
EIA
one
is one
last
of our
one over
favorites.
here.
Yeah.
It's true.
Hi, my name is Anupam Khanna. I just happen to be visiting from Delhi. My affiliation is I'm on the board of Indigo, which is the world's most fuel-efficient airline. I'm also a visiting scholar at Stanford.
And I'm a frequent flyer of that airline.
Yeah. So, but more relevant to this topic is actually that I stepped down recently as head of the Indian IT Industries Policy Group, NASSCOM. And before that, I was chief economist for Shell in London. So the question I have is actually coming back. I'm very interested because I'd like to congratulate you. The idea of focusing on energy and state level is something that I pushed for 30 years at the World Bank, which is where I worked, and even at the policy level, how could we engage subnationally? The problem I have is that, what happens in India, you have what are called policies at the top. They're really not policies. And I'm informally advising a lot of both central and state level government and NASSCOM. The other problem is there are lots of flowers blooming at the level below. The problem that arises and I'll give you the example of renewables, why it's going to grind down right now, is that the government is not connected, joined up in the Blairian sense. Right. So for example, 175 gigawatt, I'm going to keep it short. It came out of somewhere. I happen to know how that target ended up being there. But at a conference that I attended at Stanford, Mark Thurber had a paper saying, how come in India gas doesn't figure at all in the INDC or the NDC? And that shows you the problem that's going to arise. And it's not just a question of grids. It's not just it's related to why you have Piyush Goyal doing 3 ministries but not oil and gas. So
we are a little bit over the closing time.
So my
yeah,
question
thanks.
is exactly how are you going to do? Are you just going to be a clearinghouse? Or are you actually going to provide some sort of a framework which integrates? Because let me give you the last point on that. The reason is, when I was in NASSCOM, the number of times senior government officers as well as industry would call me up and say, hey, we are getting a mission from US IBC, or we're getting something from State Department. What are they peddling now? They're pushing this. They're pushing this. Can you tell me, what does it, and I'll give you an example. Intellectual property and cross-border data flows were the last 2 things that I had to basically educate them on the basics of what the dialogue was. So I think that's what's needed, something to bridge that. And I'm wondering how you're going to go doing that. Sorry,
Well-
I took too long.
I'd say, it's going to be both clearinghouse as well as framework kind of stuff. Framework kind of stuff, there's work being developed right now to develop model PPAs, different types of payment security. It's not the first time this has been attempted, but, for us to bring whatever kind of brain power and expertise we can for that. Framework in another way. There's in our initial conversations, a number of major U.S. research institutions have turned down clean energy cooperative programs because the paperwork is very, very difficult to surmount because the tax implications of doing that. Can there be like a green channel for cooperation for getting these agreements done? Another area of a framework, for instance, would be as India thinks about about the mega grid, mini grids, and home. What happens when those meet? And a lot of states haven't thought through. So if a developer goes in, puts $50 million to build a mini grid, what happens when the state grid hits that? They might lose the investment. So some are not investing because of that. So there's some framework things like that where there's been some work done that we've already begun to uncover that we'd like to share. And some states may listen and some won't. A clearinghouse for sure. There is so much great stuff that's being done by institutions across the United States that have not yet even thought about India. And to think about going to the state level, what state do I go to? And the actors change every 5 years. So, that's our role is to try to help map that out. If you have this technology, we know the state that's looking for it. So it's going to be a bit of both. That's my thought on it.
I think that's all exactly right, but it's also not the totality of the engagement. In other words, I don't think we want to pretend that this is the entirety of engagement in the United States and India on energy. I think this is we already have work that recognizes exactly what you described. We're aware of the challenges. But I think that, you never lose money betting against reform and change, right? That's one way what's one attitude. But I take the opposite. In other words, yes, it's failed so far, but I think that we're in a different moment of opportunity in the energy space worldwide and in India specifically. And because the United States is today the undisputed leader in this field, in this world, I think there's a match there that we can do it. There's no shortage of challenges. And what you talk about natural gas that you just mentioned is a critical problem for India. And must be solved, and it's not about regulation, it's more about pricing, and it is priced out of the mix at the moment in order to support coal. So at some point, we're pushing coal in it and renewables and squeezing out gas. I personally think that's a mistake, but it doesn't matter at the end of the day to me for this purpose of this initiative. Because what we have to solve is two basic elements. How do you create the public policy that will allow financial institutions outside of India, not only multilateral, but actually private financial institutions, to come in and support energy transformation and investment by the private sector. And therefore, the role of the public sector is not to do the work. It's actually to do the minimum that is necessary to allow the private sector to come in and do the investment. Because right now, that's where the block is. The private sector says, India is great, but I'm not investing. And the reasons why they're not investing is not solvable by the private sector in India. It is solvable some by the central government. And the reason we're doing this initiative is because if you only stay at the central level, you'll never solve the problem, because where the work is really being done, both for the positive and where it's grounding to a halt, is in the states. So if we can provide what Rick just talked about at the state level, in conjunction with what the rest of us are doing at the federal government to government level, maybe that together will enable us to see the growth that we are all hoping for.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out today. Giving us this opportunity to really expand some of our state's work in such a critical area. A lot of you have ideas. We certainly heard that during the Q&A. Please do leave your information. Join us for a reception outside, exchange business cards. There's a lot of work to be done in this space, and we'd like to get moving on it. So thanks all for coming out today.
Thank you, Rick.